we can start off this session on building capacity and resilience of European think tanks. Thanks for everyone who joined. I can't see you, unfortunately, but we hope this will be an interactive session. We're in a smaller group, so please don't hesitate to also ask your questions and come in with your ideas. This is really supposed to be a brainstorming session after we present you how to build resilience and capacity in European think tanks. I'm Sophie Ponschlegel. I'm a senior policy analyst at the European Policy Center, which is a Brussels-based think tank, and with me is Fabian Zulik, who is the managing director of the EPC. I already said hi to you, Fabian, and he will be presenting to you a few ideas in a minute. What we wanted to do is, if you could present yourself in the chat box, that would be amazing. Just add your name, your organization, and maybe where you're based, so we have a better idea of who's in this room at this moment. We'll start off with a poll straight away because we wanted you to, well, start thinking about this topic. And what would be great is if you could join slido.com. And there's this number, so it's number 655092, and just type in basically a response to this question. So it's an open question, but we would be really amazed to know what you think about European think tanks and how they can build resilience and capacity. I see responses coming in. So we see cooperate, new leadership skills. Okay, yes, think tanks need to cooperate more. I think that's an important one. Expand donor base, and when possible, adapt and include new priority areas of work, such as health and climate. Very important one. Talk and listen. I like this one as well. So dialogue. Great. In that case, I start off straight away. And I'll give the floor to Fabian to give us a small introduction into what think tanks are, how we should build resilience in European think tanks, and then also with a great idea on how to better cooperate as well. So I would say, Fabian, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks everyone for joining the session today. I'm very much hoping that we can have a dialogue on this. It's not that I have all the answers, but I think my starting point has been working in European think tanks and also looking at the European think tank sector, is that there are a number of structural problems which would need to be addressed. It already starts with what I see as a major issue, that we are a very diverse sector, and there's no clear definition of what a think tank actually is. One of the things which has always been very interesting to look at from a European perspective is when you come to the European Union, every sector, every subsector is represented here. You have organizations sometimes with the obscurest small areas which they represent, but there's nothing representing think tanks. And I think that that lack of some form of overall structure is also a reflection of the diversity in the sector. And that also leads to a situation where we have organizations call themselves think tanks, which are not, which are set up, for example, for lobbying purposes, which are single interest, but they can call themselves a think tank, and there's nothing to indicate that they are or they are not. I think what is also important is that think tanks are different from academic institutions, from pure research institutions. We have that focus on policy. That is clearly what guides us. So what we are looking for as think tanks is to have impact on policy rather than publications. And that means there are also different ways in which we work. Much of the work of a think tank can happen behind closed doors. It's not public, as in academic research. So that adds to the complexity of the sector. I think what also is very clearly diverse is the funding model. They are very differently funded think tanks, which then also have different incentives, different values, different ways of looking at things. We have some publicly funded think tanks, we have party political think tanks, we have a range of different think tanks. So all of that, I think, adds to the difficulty of having something for the sector as a whole. But I think, on the other hand, think tanks have become more important. I would say that we have a role in democracy to challenge policymakers. In some ways, not dissimilar to the media. Not, of course, doing the same thing, but I would say in terms of having a role within democracy. But that also means there's a responsibility, because think tanks, through their work, can also undermine democracy. For example, by manipulating policymaking or public opinion, as we have also seen in a number of countries in the European Union, in the United States, and other places. On top of all that, we have the impact of COVID. I think in the end, COVID-19 will have a negative impact on funding for think tanks. But it is not only that. COVID-19 also is changing the way we work. It is challenging think tanks. It is making some things more difficult, but it's also making other things easier. Linking across borders now electronically has become easier. So there are also opportunities from COVID, but it is certainly a mixed picture. The next slide, please. So I think what is important is that we build the resilience and the capacity of the sector as a whole. I think that starts from the protection of the independence, or as somebody in a previous discussion has highlighted, it's maybe not independence, maybe a more accurate term is something like intellectual autonomy. But the idea here is very clear, that think tanks are not guns for hire, which provide a particular picture because they're paid for it, but that they have an intellectual autonomy. And that needs to be safeguarded through governance structures, through transparency in particular. From our perspective, I think it's very important that there is also a multi-stakeholder approach, that it is not a particular interest which is being embodied by that think tank, and that we have to be also mindful of diversity in the broadest sense. Whenever I talk about this topic, it always comes back to funding, because I think that is ultimately the fundamental challenge which is there. I think if funding was conditional on ethical principles, think tanks would act differently. But that also means funders have to act differently. They have to move away from small-scale project funding, where think tanks don't have the ability to use the funding to build capacity, to build some of these more fundamental building blocks of what a professional and ethical think tank should be. We have a number of ideas of how that could be done, but certainly having long-term funding, having funding which is based more on organizational transformation, on capacity building, on operational grants rather than project grants. I think all of these would make an enormous difference to the sector. And it could even be done through some common vehicles. I think we also have to bear in mind that some think tanks have a lot less capacity, that maybe even when we're looking at a discussion like the one we're having today, who are the ones who are not taking part in that discussion because they simply don't have the capacity to do that. So we need to look also at how can you create the capacity across the board. In Europe, for example, particularly in some Central and Eastern European countries, where not only do they have limited capacity, but they are also under pressure from governments. So also providing as a sector some form of safe haven for think tanks to operate in, I think is very important. I think it is useful to develop ethical guidelines for the sector. I do believe that that has to be done from the sector itself. It's not something which should be imposed from the outside. But I think it is important that we actually can also show to the rest of the world that we do follow certain principles, and that there is a way to distinguish between think tanks and, if you like, black sheep. Next slide, please. I think one way we could build capacity is to have a European alliance of independent think tanks. I think having a structure like that would be enormously helpful, but it has to be funded. It has to be transparent, and it also has to have clear criteria for membership. But I think if you could build something like that and potentially even have some form of physical form of that, a think tank house, something like that, then that would provide, I think, a number of important functions, from exchanging experiences to training and development, to lobbying on behalf of the think tank sector, to support the safe haven concept I've just been talking about, helping also with the transnationalization of think tanks, helping to connect think tanks across Europe, and to provide better information on the sector, potentially even developing a methodology for ranking. I think there could be questions about, if you like, quality marks. There could be something which recognizes that a think tank follows certain principles. So I think there are a number of things. I didn't want to do a definitive list because, firstly, it shouldn't be prescriptive. I think this is something which should be developed with the sector, but it also is not exhaustive. I think there are many other avenues which could be explored once you have this kind of structure in place. Next slide, please. So finally, just to very briefly finish on the ethical framework, I think the Alliance could help very much also building an ethical framework for the sector. There's a link here to a project which EPC has been involved in, which is called the ProRes project, where we have developed an ethical framework for non-academic research organizations, as well as academic research organizations in the non-medical field. There are some statements there which we would also encourage think tanks to sign up to if they think that this is a useful route to go down. But I think an alliance, Enrique was asking, an association, a union, yes, these are also appropriate terms, but something like this could, I think, take forward a lot of the work also on a code of conduct, on an ethical framework, and I do think this would be a useful avenue to explore. With that, and I know I've gone through it rather quickly, I'm very happy to come back to any of those aspects. But I think from our perspective, it would just be great to have reflections from the participants. But I'll hand over to Sophie to manage the discussion.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for getting us through this. I have an echo again. You, Fabian. I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for getting us through this short input and presenting a few ideas on how we could build resilience and capacity. And I'd just like to stress again that within the COVID-19 crisis, I think it's really important that we have this conversation at this point in time, knowing that the crisis might have negative effects on think tanks or less funding, which might also be have repercussions on the funding structures. So before we continue speaking, it would be great to hear from you. We listed a few questions there. It would be great to hear from you what you think of such a European alliance, or as Enrique put it, an association or even a union. I'm not sure union would be the right word. It's something to discuss. And also straight away, whether you think that you would participate in such an alliance. If yes, why? And if no, why not? What are you missing? As Fabian said, it's not supposed to be prescriptive, but rather throwing a few ideas into this. What is really important is to have the buy-in of the organizations that would participate in, to make sure it's a cooperative framework and not something that is led on only by one think tank, but really that it's a common and so I've spoken already too much as well. So if anyone wants to come in, please just unmute your microphone and tell us what you think about the European Alliance of Independent Think Tanks.
Hi, can you hear me?
Now we can. Great.
It is very early for me, so I won't show my face, although I think you got a glimpse. Thank you for joining. I think this is something that I remember Simon Maxwell having discussed a long time ago, more than a decade ago, I think, that there should be an ethical code for think tanks, that there could be some kind of, I don't know if he used the term alliance, but some sort of accreditation for think tanks is, I think, what he's discussed. And in my conversation with him, we always come up with two challenges, at least on my side. One is the definition, as you said, and as we heard yesterday, the definition of a think tank, either using the label or in practice what a think tank is, it might change from country to country. It might change from sector to sector. It might change from time to time as well, because think tanks change themselves in the way they look, in the way they in the things they do. So this alliance would have to figure that out. Would have to have either a very flexible definition or would have to have a very rigid. And I think that would probably define its success. And the other challenge, of course, is why, right? Why would you join? And I think that this alliance would have to have the power to represent and defend the best interests of the group. That's why I used the word union, or I didn't want to say lobby in my comment, but in a way it would have to lobby on behalf of this group, right? On the tax exemptions, recognition of their ethical standards, and even, I think this is the key thing, and this is where the European space comes into action, even access to certain funds, right? Because there will be think tanks that do not need belonging to any alliance to get funds. As you said, Fabian, many of them have other business models, right? They're not necessarily there to do research on public policy issues and try to inform policy. They're much more about advocacy and influence, even in private, right? So they might not need this funding. But it'll be interesting. The second challenge, I think, is to find the core attracting force, right, for organizations. Is it at a national level? Is it at a regional level? I mean, that's a question to address. Yeah, those are two challenges, I think, that really addressed your question about why would a think tank participate, right? I think it's because they see themselves represented in the in the description of what a think tank is, and there's something clearly for them in this. And I think funding, as you said, Fabian, is always one of those things that comes up. So can an alliance like this help think tanks access funding? Or as another reason why I think think tanks participate just occurred to me, but yesterday we heard about think tanks in democratic transitions or the other way around. And it might be very interesting for some think tanks to participate in an alliance that will see other members in more stable countries or more freer countries defend them if things go the wrong way in their own countries. A bit of a NATO type of alliance. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrique. If someone else wants to come in, also I saw that someone from India is joining, and I know it's a discussion that is rather Eurocentric in that sense, because we looked at more regional think tanks with, especially within the EU as such, but it would also be great to hear your opinion, an external opinion on what Europeans are doing in that. So please don't hesitate to come in, even if you're not part of the European think tank scene in that.
Just on the definition, yes, I think that is a challenge, but I would put it in a way the other way around. I would say that what we're actually looking for is to some extent self-selection. So if you put up what are the kind of characteristics, what kind of principles we think people should follow, and then think tanks would self-select whether that is something which they would be willing to do. Now, of course, those principles also have to be defined together, but I think to some extent that would already have a filtering effect. It would be for those think tanks who sign up to intellectual autonomy, to transparency, to the kind of principles we're talking about. I think in terms of the incentives which could be there, I fully agree funding is part of that. Also, I think, and that comes back to the point I was making about capacity building, about training, about all those, that it would be far easier to get funding for capacity building if it was channeled through something like this. I could imagine that a number of, for example, foundations would be much happier to provide funding to an umbrella organization of some form, which can provide that, rather than to individual think tanks. And I think there is also a very practical reason. I think we are going to get, as a sector, and we are already starting to see that in Europe, we are going to get much more pressure to also account for how we conduct ourselves, and funders are going to ask more and more also these ethical questions. One of the reasons why this ProRes project, which I was talking about, exists is because the European Union is funding it. Because the European Union wants to ensure in its granting of research money that the money goes to organizations which follow certain principles. So that kind of overall pressure is going to get stronger. And here I think it is particularly important for also organizations, think tanks, which don't have a huge capacity, which are not particularly large. They will simply not be able to access this kind of funding because they can't demonstrate to the European Commission, to the European Research Council, whoever it is who gives out the money, that they fulfill the criteria to be included. So to have some form of union, alliance, association, which also gives an outward sign, maybe some form of quality mark, which says, no, this is an organization which follows certain principles, which is committed to certain principles, I think is useful. I think on a European perspective, there's also the possibility of using this much more to link what is happening at the national level with what is happening at the European level. There still is quite a disconnect between the two, and only for the very largest and richest think tanks is it even possible to have, for example, a representation in Brussels. So having some form of ability to have that transnational debate, to link into European policy debates from a national level, but also to have the European level link much better to the national level. I think this would also be a benefit of this. And I think this safe haven concept, I think, is also very important. It might well be that an alliance like this could provide, for example, researchers from countries which are where they are under pressure, with a place from where they can work, from where they can publish, from where they can do things, which they can't do at home. So all of these, I think, are important considerations. I think, and just to pick up the point, Sophie, you made about Eurocentric. I mean, yes, there's a certain Eurocentric element to this because it reflects the specificities of Europe. But I think this kind of model could also be something which you could do in other regions. So it's not necessarily a model which is Eurocentric. I think this particular expression might be Eurocentric. But the concept, I think, could also apply in other regions.
Thanks, Fabian. Important point you made. Just to say that, of course, it makes sense to have regional alliances in the sense that there are already things there between European member states that could, of course, help. And I think it might also be important at a closer cooperation of European think tanks in the first place, knowing that you have that political framework within the EU already. But it would be great to see more regional organizations like this emerge. Henning already joins us with the video, so thanks for being there, and come in with your comments, Henning.
Thank you, Sophie. Can you understand me? Yes. I have like two remarks to make. One is more on the tasks of a European alliance of think tanks, and the other is on the structure. I could imagine a couple of tasks, and that might have been in the presentation as well, and I've overlooked it. But I think an alliance like that should be aware that all think tanks benefit from a landscape of strong think tanks. And so it might be in the interest of all, not in competition, but rather to create a hub for skills, for new software, statistics, writing, presentation, imagery, something that will actually help think tanks to better present their results to a public and to the think tank, to the decision makers. Second, of course, also, since we are in a phase or an era, I think, where not only from populists but from others, there is a waning credibility of experts. You know, I don't want to hear the experts. I want to be entertained in politics and all that. So I think this is a trend that the think tanks should work against. And I think an alliance could help with that by creating maybe a certificate, some sort of credibility boost for the think tanks that participate. Like about the size, about the ethics that are applied, about the publications that are made, about the soundness of research, whatever we could think of. And thirdly, we shouldn't forget, and you said that already, not to be Eurocentric and rather look out and help think tanks make contacts to non-European actors, to be visible as European think tanks to the outside, but also introduce insights from other countries to Europe. The second thing is, I believe there are already a number of think tank alliances, of course, on specific research areas or policy fields, on non-proliferation and arms control, for instance, on EU neighborhood policy. I'm sure there are more on financials than anything. And I think there might be a greater incentives of think tank to join such an alliance because it is more focused and is more related to their work. And one could think of either a bottom-up approach of think tank alliances forming an alliance, or an alliance of European think tanks helping to form such focus-based networks. Thank you.
anything? I don't know, Fabian, if you want to come in straight.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the functions, I think there's all kind of useful functions you can think of. So I would fully agree. I mean, there are also other things we have been thinking about. For example, one of the things could be also trans-European projects, which are very difficult to do at the moment. So having some form of common approach on that. But for me, the key thing here would be that this truly should be an alliance of think tanks, where the think tanks which would participate would also sit down together and say, what is the most pressing need we have? What are the areas we want to progress? What can we also do in terms of getting funding for that together? So for me, this would be something which would be developed by this alliance. And yes, I'm aware of a number of organizations, networks, which tend to be rather more topic specific. What I see is that in general they miss much of a central structure. It tends to be more ad hoc, and that I think imposes also certain limitations, not because of the goodwill of the organizations involved, but just because there isn't the capacity to do certain things. And I think this would provide also capacity. I mean, that's why I also was emphasizing it needs to have funding behind it. This is not something which is just simply we get together and we talk about things together, but this needs to have a certain weight also in terms of funding behind it. But I also don't see anything which would prevent integrating some of these structures into something like this that could well work in parallel. So for me, this is a rather flexible way of doing things. But I do think we are missing something central, something which acts for the sector as a whole, which does also do the lobbying for the sector, or the interest representation for the sector, which can speak as a voice for the sector. And I think one of the interesting things, if people are interested in looking a bit more into this, is the European Foundation Center in Brussels, which was established as a kind of alliance of European foundations. And that has enabled the European foundations to do a lot more together and to work together in a much more structured way, even to the point of having now Philanthropy House in Brussels, which hosts activities for the participating foundations. So that is a kind of model, I think, which is interesting to look at. Of course, it's not a one-to-one, but I think there is a good example of a sector looking at their European footprint, looking at what they needed and deciding that they needed some form of structure to bring them together, to enable them to have, in the end, more impact. And that, I think, is exactly what would be behind this. It is a cooperation across the sector, which enables all of us to jointly have more impact.
Yeah, thanks, Fabian. EFC, maybe just to add, could see as well is that when foundations pool their funding in initiatives such as Civitatis, they have a much bigger impact in agenda setting, but also in what they can achieve. So really trying to push some topics. And I think for think tanks, there's still this difficulty of trying to find funding for a think tank partner. So competition might be good, but sometimes it might also not be the best, or sometimes more useful if you certain topics to be set on the agenda of policymakers to have a bigger impact in one direction or the other.
Yes, I just want to I think I first heard you talk about this, Fabian, last year in the middle of the pandemic, right? And I was at first maybe sounded very critical, but I mean I do like the idea of a representative of think tanks, or we have to figure out what that is. But I do like the idea. I do like the idea of some code of conduct, to some minimum level of ethical considerations for think tanks. I do think that not every think tank will join or want to join, and some will probably find it more useful not to be part of this. There might be observers at most, but I've been thinking about this, and I think you probably need a few founding members, large, somewhat strong, powerful. As I was writing this, I started thinking about the European Super League. So you need them to be motivated by other than greed, I guess. So large think tanks that will say, yes, I like this. This is a good idea, right? So I think these larger think tanks, these larger founding members will attract others in the future. I also think you might need partners for some of the things you do. So, for example, I'm happy to volunteer as an early partner. Content. Henning was saying, one of the key things to offer would be training, capacity building, opportunities, information. We've got a lot of that. I'm happy to make that available. To us, it's always easier to target an audience rather than just. So you need to give services, things that think tanks will get. Maybe you want to bring in some of these, the communication firms such as Soapbox or Custom Clay, who join these events, or others, not just think tanks to this group, but others that offer services, offer information, offer tools, skills to these partners. And then, of course, you need funders. You need a couple of funders or a funder to start this process, right? To say, I am going to provide funding for X, Y, Z through this alliance. It might be Catalyst Fund. We've been playing with the idea for a while of having kind of a shared reserves fund. Small think tanks in particular, they struggle at the end of every year because their budgets don't go far into the next year. And sometimes a small shock might mean they can't pay salaries, even if they have a contract. If they work with the EU, often the EU doesn't pay right away. You have to wait a few months until you get your first payment. And small think tanks can't afford that. So having some sort of mechanism tanks to deal with these shocks, or making small investments in their own capacity, could be a useful service for them. So having a funder would be useful to get this started. Anyway, that's my contribution. I think that would be key ingredients to get this started. And I think maybe from EPC, you have partners who could be the founding members. As I said, I'm happy to help. And then the third component, of course, would be the difficult one. But you need a funder to come in. Right? I'll leave the space so that others can join.
Yeah, thank you, Enrico, and thanks for making those points. I think it's really important to look at the next steps and what will be an alliance. And I now have two people who came in. Once Anna, I don't know if you want to say something, and Roderick, who I see with camera. So maybe if you want to start off, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for having me. A really interesting discussion. I think this is an incredibly important issue. Maybe just briefly introducing myself. I work for the Mercator Institute for China Studies, and the Mercator Institute for China Studies together Foreign Relations has set up the Think Tank Lab, which is kind of exactly what you described, Fabian. We're based in Berlin, but it's a 3-year project. We're started now. We're still in the research phase, and it's thinking about how can we create a community of practice. How can we, offer trainings and training programs and capacity buildings for think tank staffers? And so we should see, how we can also create synergies between these two initiatives. And I think what would be very important for such a European alliance, I'm very keen on it, but I think it would have to start out with a clearly defined field, like a clearly defined issue. So like you said, bring together a group of like-minded think tanks, like-minded people ideally some of the big ones, of course, but not to the detriment of smaller ones, and define one priority issue. I think that could be ethics, could be, looking for an ethical label. I think it could be very well the safe haven one. I am a bit skeptical about this idea of certifying think tanks with credibility. It sounds a bit like think tanks are giving themselves a certificate and giving themselves credibility, when credibility usually comes better when it's from other people. And also it should come, I think, particularly with citizen engagement. And I want to play a little bit devil's advocate. So I thought I'd ask you one question that might be a bit provocative, and which is, to what extent is such a European alliance not just outsourcing the problems that think tanks themselves have? That think tanks themselves are not innovative enough when it comes to organizational development, when it comes to staff development, when it comes to creating new formats. So to what extent could this European alliance actually be a place where it's like, oh, it's fine. We don't, in our think tank world, in our own think tank, we don't need to bother about this anymore because we're paying every year this much money to a European think tank alliance. Let them figure it out. And, we just stay in our, so it's the kind of thing where you feel good about yourself. You think you're doing something because you're part of this think tank house, but actually change is not happening in your own organization. Thank you.
Thanks, Roderick. A very good point, and it's always good to play devil's advocate to, foster the debate. I don't know if Fabian, you want to come in straight away?
Sure. Just one thing I think which is important, and I'm not saying that in the sense of one or the other, but I think it is important that we keep in mind that we have a European dimension and a national dimension, and that for me is one of the key driving forces behind that in Europe, is that within Europe, for me, European policy has to be a component of national policy, and that also means that national think tanks have to have a European component. So this is, how do we actually make that effective? And that also goes to the last point, Roderick. I don't think this will ever replace the core activities of a think tank, not in a positive or a negative sense, because I think this is a particular aspect which it would cover. But it wouldn't be the case that you could simply say, okay, we have now paid some money. And in effect, I'm actually thinking that for a number of think tanks, it would not actually be a membership fee-based model. Because if we're looking at think tanks which don't have the capacity, it would be the wrong signal to exclude them on the basis that they can't pay a membership fee. But what I do see, and I think that also shows in the establishment of the think tank lab, what I do see is there is actually quite a demand among funders to have something like this. And particularly the foundations are pushing quite hard. And I think for the foundations, an alliance like this could be rather the opposite from what you were saying. It could be a lever which they can use to also force think tanks to spend time, resources, investment on organizational development, on capacity building, on professionalization of management, accounting, etc. And it would be far easier for them to do that through a common vehicle like that than on the basis of individual grants to particular think tanks, which raises a number of different questions. I also think there's a great capacity in something like this to simply share experiences. I think for many of us, particularly now with COVID-19, but even beforehand, the question of digitalization, how do we actually deal with the opportunities which are there with new technologies, but also with the undoubted challenges which are there in switching to these kind of formats. And if you bring people together to simply share their experience, to simply say, this is what we are doing, this is how this is working for us, I think that in itself has an enormous potential to help people to make these kind of transformations. So I would see it rather more as a driver for change than something which gives people an excuse not to do something.
We have a few minutes left. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in with questions. I mean, we discussed a lot that one initiative or idea that we proposed, but we didn't discuss too much the ethical framework. Roderick said that certification might not be the right aspect. I think it's an important topic as well. We haven't discussed it as much. It's good. It's interesting to see that the alliance in itself was apparently of a bigger interest. But if you want to comment also on other topics such as the ethical framework, or if you think that we missed out on certain aspects of building resilience and capacity in European think tanks that I would like to mention, please come in now. It's our last opportunity, and I know we have a few other people in the session.
Can I maybe just mention something on certification, quality labels, all that? Because I think it's a really interesting topic, because also I think a lot of funders are looking for it. They would like to have something which they can use as orientation. But I would agree that it's not the right approach to say we will have some form of board which will then put a certificate out. Those kind of things, firstly, it looks a bit like the sector serving itself, but also there's a question of how fair can you make that, how effective can you make that. But what I would say, which for me is a relatively simple thing, but is if you are part of an alliance like that, you commit to certain principles. And to simply being able to state there are these common principles we have all committed to, and we are willing to be measured by them. I think that in itself already is some form of quality mark, because what you're giving is you're giving a public signal that you're willing to be held up by the standards you've set yourself. So for me, that would be a way this could work. But again, this is about having a discussion between think tanks to see also what makes sense. So there's no preconceived model which is there.
Thank you for mentioning this. I see we have Lanois' comment from Nicolas Luc. He says, I do see the benefits of trans-European bottom-up initiatives to establish and set ethical norms for think tanks' work and research. However, questions remain how larger think tanks, like the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, could be motivated to fund and or join such a formalized initiative. How to motivate larger think tanks to join? Many institutes might already proclaim that they do just fine on their own financially and regarding their ethical framework. He says that he cannot join with a video. And I think maybe, Fabian, if you want to respond to that, because it's a good question to say, if larger think tanks cannot join, it might be important to have such great actors on board. And if they say, we don't really need it because we already have the funding and we have our own ethical guidelines, how can we make sure we incentivize those as well to join such an initiative at European level?
I think firstly, and I think it's a point Enrique made, it is not necessary that everybody joins. And I would say to some extent, there's also demonstrating success while doing it will motivate others to join. So if it turns out to be something useful, I think people will start to want to join as well. So I think that would also then encourage some of the bigger think tanks. But I think here, and this is one of the peculiarities I was referring to with respect to a European alliance, the European dimension, I think what could be possible through this is to create this better linkage between the national level and the European level. And that, I think, is in the interest of European think tanks, such as the EPCs, but also of national think tanks, because those two debates are often very much disconnected. And I know that a number of think tanks at the national level also have an office in Brussels, but that's not the same thing. You're not involved in the discussions in the same way as if you would be structurally represented here. So I think there could be an incentive through that. I think also there is an incentive through funding. My impression is that even the largest think tanks do have funding challenges and do look for additional funding. And I think particularly the institutions and the foundation sector would be quite willing to provide substantive funding behind an organization like this, which would then benefit all of the members.
Thank you, Fabian. And I would also say that it was mentioned beforehand in the presentation, but also national think tanks might want to look beyond borders, because there are spillover effects. If you look at erosions of democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, for instance, it will have an effect in the long term on the quality of the debates also at European level, and that will also have an effect on think tanks that might be in other countries. So really realizing that you're enough to just look at yourself and look also more sustainably in the long term might be important, because I think especially the safe haven and making sure that you support democracies is an aspect that I find particularly interesting in that proposition for an alliance. I mean, we know that in some smaller countries, it's getting extremely difficult for think tanks to do their work properly, and giving them the opportunity to not only build capacities, but also have some funding, for instance, I think that could be something that I would find quite interesting. We're already touching at the end of this session. I know it was an hour. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who joined the discussion and discussed it openly with us. It's surely not the last time you will hear from this initiative. I know there's the Think Tank Lab of DGAP and Merrick's doing something in the same direction, so I'm looking forward to being in touch with them as well. And hopefully we can continue discussing this. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. There's a slide with our contact details via Twitter, via email. Fabian and I are happy to keep on discussing this topic. Thanks, Fabian, for the input, and thanks everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of the conference.